Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, sitting in for Riz Khan. Thanks for joining us for this Riz Extra. We're speaking about the achievements and shortcomings of the G20 Crisis Summit in London today with veteran British politician Tony Benn. Mr. Benn, thanks for joining us. First question is, will more regulation and a clean-up of the banks, as we've been hearing, really help prevent a crisis like this from happening again?
No. The banks are so important for the funding of economic development and the funding of personal loans for homes and cars. The banks should be publicly owned and publicly accountable. You don't have a privatized army, you don't have a privatized police, you don't have a privatized school system. Some things are so essential, that's the first thing. On equality, I looked at what the level of taxation was when Winston Churchill, the Conservative Prime Minister, was last Prime Minister in 1945 at the end of the war. And at that stage, because of the need to share the burden, the taxation on the very wealthy was, wait for it, 95%. And although it's very difficult to imagine the parallel today, so many people at the bottom end are suffering, and there's still people living on enormous incomes. And I think the sharing of the burden through a fair tax system would go a long way to make the present situation more tolerable and provide money for the things that need to be done.
Now, to turn to the protests that took place in London during this summit on Wednesday, there were 10,000, or rather 4,000 people that turned up at the protests. Were you disappointed because there were expected to be about 100,000 people there?
Well, I spoke in Trafalgar Square yesterday. There were masses of meetings. There were about 8,000 there. This was about the war. And there have been 15,000 earlier, but I noticed the media always say, aren't you disappointed? But I tell you one thing I noticed, and I've noticed it for a long time, the BBC never, ever, ever reports a single speech made at a public meeting. All they do is send a film unit hoping there'll be an arrest or a scuffle or a fight or a Muslim with a beard waving his fist. And they have a rule. You present the public as a sort of rabble, and you only concentrate on what's said by the rich and powerful. So I'm very disappointed by the media coverage, but still, I've lived with that for so long, I know what it's about. And it's happened to be in the past. I spoke in Trafalgar Square in 1964 when a well-known terrorist was sentenced to life imprisonment, and I was ignored and attacked. Next time I met him, he had a Nobel Peace Prize and was president of South Africa. So the media should take more interest in what's said in the streets, because the politics of tomorrow are discussed in the streets and the politics of today are discussed in Parliament and the Congress.
Getting back to the summit, do you think any of the pledged money will go to developing and poor countries?
Well, I think the basis of all banking is it goes where it's profitable. I mean, by law, a board of directors of a company, of a bank, has to invest their money and reach their decisions on the basis of what's most profitable to their shareholders. And in those circumstances, it would be illegal for a bank to put money in to help unless it's profitable. And I think these are the questions, you see, that are raised by the summit. And that's why I think this is the end of an era and the beginning of a new era.
Do you think we will ever see genuine reform in the IMF so that poor countries have more say?
Well, on the democratic basis that I mentioned, the votes for the IMF should be voted for by whoever runs the IMF, voted for by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the basis of the population of the member states. That's how democracy works in America, what they call the equal representation of districts, the same in Britain. And in the world system, we don't have that. The rich countries dominate, and there is no democracy. And I think global democracy, which would be a tremendously exciting thing to do, like the setting up of the American Constitution or the development of democracy in other parts of the world, global democracy would transform the world, because the poor would have a vote and they would go for policies which benefited them, and that really would make a difference.
And finally, and this is a big question, what is your solution to solving the world global economic crisis?
Well, I mentioned some of it. I think the banks, because of their importance, should be publicly owned and publicly accountable. I think the money should be put in not just to bail out banks and their toxic debts, but put in to those urgent public projects that need to be done. I mentioned homes as one very good example, but there are other examples as well. And in America, if I were the President of the United States, first thing I'd do, set up a national health insurance so that the people who now are dependent on their wealth or insurance to get medical care would get it. We've done it in Britain for 50 years, and it's been the most successful thing we ever did, and the most popular, and the most socialist too.
Tony Benn, former British Minister and one of the country's longest-serving parliamentarians, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will see you the next time.